Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. I hope it's been a good week for everybody. If you're just finding this work for the first time, I do recommend you go back and watch my first couple videos, as it will act as a solid foundation for what I'm about to get into to continue the Earth grid patterns and ley lines research that I've started by correlating what Florida Maquis has been finding with the pentagonal and hexagonal structures on the Earth grid. Of course, as a refresher, to kind of match up with this type of a pattern that you see, and going back through the previous research, also fractally expanding the Earth, that is, along these nodal points on the buckyball structure. So if that's all a mouthful and confusing to you, again, I do recommend you go back to my previous videos, as I'm going to keep going on this research at least for the next couple videos, and we're going to go straight into some deeper concepts relating to ley lines, the structures that sit on them, monoliths, or simply architecturally significant in nature, and see what those are all about. I've got two books in front of me today too, because we're going to take a little bit of a detour away from this. I'm going to give you a teaser as to what the next video is going to entail. It's going to tie these points in Ireland together with some of the constellations that you may see up in the night sky. Draco here is pictured, and I promise this is going to be a cool second step to come back to. But in order to get here, we do unfortunately have to start with these two books, predominantly, in fact, this book, Babylon's Banksters, which I actually referenced in my first video, if anybody remembers that. We're going to go through a couple of these excerpts and actually tie them with another researcher that I have not mentioned yet, by the name of Bix Weir, whose channel on YouTube is actually right here. He's another very prolific YouTuber, and I recommend everybody comes to his page, subscribes, and goes into what I'm going to tie together today with this Babylon's Banksters book and his road to Roota theory. So I'll give you a brief primer as to kind of what all of this stuff entails. Of course, Joseph P. Farrell's brilliant research. I'm going to do a little bit of a plug for him, and I do recommend you come here and buy his book from Amazon. It's only 20 bucks. Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, which is the other one I mentioned, also only 20 bucks. And these will give you, I promise, a much deeper explanation into what's going on with the Earth's ley line and grid network than you can possibly imagine. But first things first, before we get into Babylon's Banksters, because this video actually is almost like my own personal gift to Bix, because it is new insight, new research that I think connects more dots to his theory than at least I've seen anybody connect. I got done reading Joseph Farrell's book, Babylon's Banksters, a few months back, and was pretty floored at a few key traits that I found in here that really tied into Bix's theory. So essentially, the part of Bix's theory that we're going to get into today, because it does have a lot to do with a comic book that he found called Wishes and Rainbows at the Fed's website. And I'm going to let you guys kind of scope in and find his research for yourself and go to his website. Maybe you subscribe to his Patreon so you guys can get his exclusive content. But his theory essentially describes what the good guys in the government have been planning to do for probably the last 50 to 70 years, to his estimation, and that's implement a new gold standard. And this is a scheme that is uncovered through the course of this book, which is kind of a cipher of sorts that shows key characters and places and things to be a lexicon of sorts for what we're probably going through in this period of time right now, in fact. And so what you're seeing right here is that cipher. You're seeing these Colorland, Boulder Ridge, Gopher Junction, Pebbleton, Pebble People. These things all have corollaries, as you can see here. What we're going to concern ourselves with mainly in correlating to Joseph Farrell's book is the fact that in his theory, he supports with a vast amount of evidence, at least a very educated guess, I would say, that the Grand Canyon houses maybe more gold than anybody can potentially fathom, billions of ounces of gold, which would then reaffirm why the Fed could have a comic book like this come out and talk about return to a gold standard, having thus enough gold to do so. One of the curious things about his theory is that the Grand Canyon has kind of a secret lore to it as well. And if you go watch his videos, you'll learn a lot more than you can from me about this, but I'll put these links in the description, of course, so everybody can kind of come and watch and educate you on these. But to fast forward to the point, what has been found in the Grand Canyon are, you can even see it in these pictures, these pyramid structures that are quite weathered at this point, but largely untalked about, especially when you talk about some of the other megalithic structures in the world. The Grand Canyon's hardly the first thing that you come to. But also that there is a lot of supporting research to suggest that there are hieroglyphics that have been found in the Grand Canyon. And he supports this research with a bunch of different events that have happened, including a plane crash that happened in 1956, right over the spot in the Grand Canyon that he contests is where these caves that lead to the Egyptian-type hieroglyphs are, and what has been remote viewed in this same location to house what looks to be slave quarters, mercenary quarters, and what was only described as a mine. And in conjunction with Bix Weir, I know we're going through a lot of different channels here to attempt to give you guys a primer, and so if there's anything that we can go back and do to go over this stuff, of course I will, but there's a reason why I'm pointing you to these other channels, is because they've done documentaries on this stuff that'll give you a lot more context. And long story short here is that these Grand Canyon remote viewing sessions revealed that there's something strange going on in the Grand Canyon. Again, you're going to have to watch this stuff to see how it correlates to Bix's Fed and return to the gold standard, I'll say, research. It has a lot to do with the cryptocurrency situation we find ourselves in today, and this changeover of financial system that we seem to be going through. And then also correlates with his work, of course, on the symbolism on the $100 bill. And then again, I'm going to leave his work to everybody to kind of look through. Before we transition off of his work, I want to give you guys a couple other things because they're pertinent to some discussions he just had, in fact, with Mr. Dick Allgeier of Crypto Viewing just yesterday as it relates to the DTCC. And this is going to be important before we get into Babylon's Banksters, because this all comes back. As few people probably realize, the DTCC during the Hurricane Sandy incident had a let's just call it a moment of neglect, to put it lightly, as it relates to some of the paper derivatives that were kept in a vault, which was physically flooded because of being deliberately left open during the Hurricane Sandy incident. Bix's research again speaks for itself there. That's about as much of a summary as you really need to get into what I'm going to point the direction on using Joseph Farrell's research, but that's one more component that we've got to get ourselves into. One more item that Bix has not firmly grasped quite yet, but is still kind of a fringe part of his theory, is this component here. And what you're looking at is some sort of a ciphered plate for a printing press or a mint. And all indications that these are Chinese in nature, Chinese derived, and that to Bix's supposition, these graphics on here may somehow be related to the Grand Canyon. I've heard him describe this as the plane crash up top that happened in 1956 to mask what may be an extraction event to take gold out of this Grand Canyon or ancient mine. And then you've got some symbolism over here next to these ciphers that to this day I still have yet to see anybody who's decoded to see what this stuff means. There's a much better research page right here that goes into a little bit more even than Bix has, I think, on this topic. But I only mention that because I think Bix is onto something also with his research, that symbolism ties together somehow to the fleur-de-lis phoenix depiction on the 1988 Economist magazine. So to sum up, before we get into Babylon's Banksters, I've got a few different components. I've got one, the Chinese, basically. Two, the Hurricane Sandy incident, which happened somehow conspicuously to erase these derivative contracts that were in a vault and flooded, and J.P. Morgan is somehow involved. And 3, we're going to talk about the Grand Canyon and how that relates to some ancient mines that Joseph Farrell references in Babylon's Banksters. So again, I strongly urge you to go look at Crypto Viewing and Road to Roota, but without further ado, I'm going to open up Joseph Farrell's book and highlight his site here while I do this to kind of get into some of this material, and I'll read this the best I can in front of the camera for you. Here we go. So I don't know if you guys can see this, but I've got this as close as I can. Relating to the Chinese, Joseph Farrell very astutely points out that there was a formula that was devised in the early 2000s by this gentleman, David Lee. And I'm going to read verbatim from this passage here so you guys can kind of get the context, and then we'll talk about it afterward. And this is on page 21 of his book, Babylon's Banksters. The section's entitled Meltdown or Message, David Lee's Formula. This most contemporary chapter of this very long and ancient story began when a Chinese mathematician, Dr. David Lee, came up with a formula that seemed a godsend to Wall Street and City of London financial manipulators. The formula, known to most economists and mathematical analysts within major banking houses, is unfamiliar to most, but like Einstein's E=mc², it is destined to become famous in history for the influence it had on human actions and politics. Here's what it looks like. And you guys can see here at the bottom of the page essentially what this formula consists of. I won't have to read that. I actually am unfamiliar with some of the non-Greek characters even there. I will continue. Lee grew up in rural China in the 1960s, eventually earned a master's degree in economics at Nankai University, and then left China to pursue an MBA from Laval University in Quebec, a master's degree in actuarial science, and a PhD in statistics from the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. By 1997, Dr. Lee had landed at Canada Imperial Bank of Commerce, later moving to Barclays Capital in 2004. I'm going to stop there and kind of give a summary for what Dr. Farrell talks about in regards to this man. He goes on throughout the chapter to describe his connections to the Lee cartel, or the Lee mafia family that is essentially tied to ancient dynastic China, and its ties to printing money. And what Dr. Farrell ends up arguing here is that this formula is perhaps, I guess, the single most effective financial weapon that's ever been created, because from this the credit default swaps were put into action. Essentially, what this formula does is remove any correlation to performance in the system of an economy based on historical data. It takes all factors, reduces them down to the same, and makes it to where you essentially run the same calculation of risk profile for each vehicle. I'm going to read this part to help you better understand that. Joseph Farrell goes on to state, to understand the mathematics of the correlation better, consider something simple like a kid in an elementary school. Let's call her Alice. The probability that her parents will get divorced this year is about 5%. The risk of getting head lice is about 5%. The chance of seeing a teacher slip on a banana peel is about 5%. And the likelihood of her winning the class spelling bee is about 5%. If investors were trading securities based on the chances of those things happening only to Alice, they would all trade at more or less the same price. But something important happens when we start looking at 2 kids rather than 1. Not just Alice, but also the girl she sits next to, Brittany. If Brittany's parents get divorced, what are the chances that Alice's parents will get divorced too? Still about 5%. The correlation there is close to 0. But if Brittany gets head lice, the chance that Alice will also get head lice is much higher, about 50%, which means that correlation is probably up in the 0.5 range. If Brittany sees a teacher slip on a banana peel, what is the chance Alice will see it too? Very high indeed. Since they sit next to each other, it could be as much as 95%, which means the correlation is close to 1. And if Brittany wins the class spelling bee, the chance of Alice winning it is 0, which means the correlation is -1. And here's the point. If investors were trading securities based on the chances of these things happening to both Alice and Brittany, the prices would be all over the place because the correlations vary so much. So that's a picture I paint for you that effectively gives you a metaphor for how Dr. Lee's formula was implemented. It created these credit default swaps. We all remember 2008 as a defining moment in our history. This book, by the way, was written in 2010 after this has happened. And this is about as good of a case as I've ever seen for financial warfare. Does it have something to do with this cipher and the reset of the world economy? I don't yet know. But I only point it out as further research and really to get in Bix's hands. As I've actually emailed him, I have emailed him this, and I may even just send him this video to see if he resonates with any of this information in video format. But that's as far as I've taken it thus far. I plan on hoping to draw some more conclusions to that, but to say the least, it's curious. Moving on to the next point, as we get closer again to the end of this video, which we'll go into more of the ley lines on the next. There is the matter of the DTCC that we were bringing up earlier, and this is something that gets into what Joseph Farrell calls high-octane speculation, which I think is, to borrow his coined term, just one of the best that I've ever heard. But it goes into, in his book, explaining a curious transaction that may be masked between the famous Nikola Tesla, who of course is a friend of the channel and might just bring back up his face as if to say, keep an open mind about any and all things related to these matters. But he goes on to explain that at the time that his famous Wardenclyffe facility was to be taken down, the traditional story basically goes on to state that Nikola Tesla lost financing. They couldn't find a means to effectively meter energy. It wasn't a return on the investment for JP Morgan. JP Morgan pulled funding, and a bunch of other details that go a bunch of different ways around that core story. As Joseph Farrell actually puts it in his book, Morgan threatened to pull the financial plug on the scheme. It was then, faced with the demise of his project, that Tesla revealed his true intentions to Morgan. He planned to beam power itself through the earth to any point on the globe. With this revelation, Morgan did pull the plug, and Tesla's grand project came to an end, and has never since been publicly viewed. So that's an alternate view as to the actual narrative, as to what may have happened to Nikola Tesla's project at Wardenclyffe. And I tend to favor this point of view, in fact, especially if you read a lot of the other previous history that Joseph Farrell argues for, not only in this book, but began in the first book in this series, oh gosh, I think it's called Cosmic War, and continues, in fact, in this one, in the Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. But essentially, what ends up happening here, as I'll show you in this passage, is that eventually it seems that powers that be may have come back around when they figured out that they could not only use this as a free energy device to beam across the planet, but could also be used as a weapon. So that's what this next section goes into, and it's titled Weaponizing Wardenclyffe and Suppressing the Scalers, Tesla at Tunguska and Morgan at Mischief. Why would Morgan pull the plug on such a scheme, virtually suppressing it and the physics it represented? After all, it is simply not true merely that he could not meter it and hence make money, for he stood to gain a great deal financially off of a worldwide royalty and licensing agreements for the system, even though such a system would, admittedly, have become much more difficult to financially monitor and secure. So while pure and simple greed may very likely have been a factor in his deliberations, it probably was not the only one. What those other modifications may have been were hinted at by Tesla himself, and a curious series of incidents that began with a French ship, the Hyena, mysteriously exploded in 1907 as Tesla's Wardenclyffe project was in its financial death throes. In an op-ed piece written that March to the editor of the New York Times, Tesla hinted at the weaponization potential of his Colorado Springs discovery and the Wardenclyffe project. And I turn the page. He goes on to say, as the projecting wave energy to any particular region of the globe, I have given a clear description of the means in technical publications. Not only can this be done by the means of my devices, but the spot at which the desired effect is to be produced can be calculated very closely, assuming the accepted terrestrial measurements to be correct. This, of course, is not the case. Up to this day, we do not know a diameter of the globe within 1,000 feet. My wireless plant will enable me to determine it within 50 feet or less, when it will be possible to rectify many geodetical data and make such calculations as those referred to with great accuracy. A year later, in 1908, the inventor was less guarded in his words. When I spoke of future warfare, I meant that it should be conducted by direct application of electrical waves without the use of aerial engines or other implements of destruction. This means, as I pointed out, would be ideal for not only would the energy of war require no effort for the maintenance of potentiality, but it would be productive in times of peace. This is not a dream. Even now, wireless power plants could be constructed by which any region of the globe might be rendered uninhabitable without subjecting population of other parts to serious danger or inconvenience. So what he goes on to state about this, and I'll sum up what Tesla is essentially saying, is that he has created within Wardenclyffe an ability to not only measure the Earth, but to get absolute, pinpoint accurate coordinate data. Why? Because Wardenclyffe tapped directly into the ley line network of the Earth. And we'll leave it there for now. But where Joseph Farrell goes with this is he suggests that using this technique, Nikola Tesla had to remarket his technology after the project was shut down by J.P. Morgan to not target an energy application, but a weapons application. And he goes on to brilliantly prescribe a theory that Tunguska was the result of Tesla testing this technology. And again, we'll leave that there for now, so we can get onto these other topics and keep this video under a half hour. The third point that I was bringing up, as you may remember, had to do with the Grand Canyon and the mines. So there are some other things I'm going to put up here as well. I think this is a mining history of the pharaohs. I'm actually going to scroll down on this because I believe in this document there was a map that showed where Joseph Farrell is going to be talking about here, and so I can give you a bit of a visual. Yeah, here we go. So before we get into the passages of Joseph Farrell's book, hold on just a second here. Just got to grab this. There we go. And this is the Red Sea, of course, and this is Greater Egypt, the Nile River, and the Bishari mines that we're going to be talking about, I don't know why this isn't stopping for me, are going to be right around that area. Further, I've got some documents here in the Glen Canyon National Recreation Area that go into some archaeological remains of things that are interesting reads, but we're not going to have time to get into that today. So anyway, back to kind of the Grand Canyon piece of the conspiracy, and we'll wrap up this video. All right, so getting back to the book, as we talked about the hieroglyphics being in the Grand Canyon, there's some more conjecture here that Joseph Farrell provides for the argument that the Bishari mines were potentially, where I just showed you next to the Red Sea there, the original mines, and that actually gold was very unprofitable to go after unless slave labor was implemented, and this may have been the goal of the original money changers from Babylon. Now I'm going to read you some stuff about the Bishari mines and kind of leave it as an open-ended piece of evidence for you to keep exploring Bix's research, and then of course we'll get on in my next video to more of the ley lines, like a lot of people are probably coming to my channel for. So Anyway, the last passage on page 166 of Joseph Farrell's books, to give a little bit of background on the Bishri mines. The Bishri mines, as noted above, are among the oldest known in antiquity and some of the most extensive. Additionally, the fields, like many gold mines, are also known for their abundant deposits of quartz. In the presence of slaves at the Bishri mines, that affords us our first significant clue into the minds and mentality of the ancient bullion bankers, and why they and their activities were so often associated with temples. Remember, the temples are the key, because the temples are the things that are located on the ley lines. It requires a closer look, which is afforded by the classical writer Diodorus Siculus. Delmar notes that Diodorus visited the mines in 50 BC. After the visit, he recorded his impressions of the mines. He states, on the confines of Egypt and the neighboring countries where there are regions full of gold mines whence, with the costs and pains of many laborers, much gold is dug. The soil is naturally black, but in the body of the earth there are many veins of shining white quartz. Glittering will all sorts of bright metals, out of which those appointed to be overseers cause the gold to be dug up by the labor of the vast multitude of people. So he goes on to describe the temples, and I'm going to fast forward to the point where he says, they are guarded by mercenary soldiers of various barbarous nations whose language is foreign to them and to each other, so that there are no means either of forming conspiracies or of corrupting those who are set to watch them. And I think that quote right there lines up directly with the work that the crypto viewing guys have done with Bix on figuring out just what the caves in the Grand Canyon were. I am going to raise the speculation that what we find at the Grand Canyon and in Bishri are one of the same culture, or descendant from the same culture, similar sites descended from the same culture. And before we close out this video, a couple points about the temple structures, which we'll get into on the next. In the section Money Kings, Temples, and Counterfeiters. First off, they state another callback to the Chinese. The archaic Chinese and Indian, as well as the early Greek coins, were often marked with emblems, which in the former cases are supposed to be, and in the latter case are known to be religious. Mints were in the temples, and the priests monopolized or tried to monopolize the secrets of metallurgy. The custom may have arisen either from the cupidity of the priesthood to reap the profits of the coinage, or solicitude on the part of the sovereign to prevent counterfeiting or to render it the more heinous. Why were there ancient mints in temples, especially if, as Delmar has conceded, and as we have already examined, the prerogative of the money issuance of the value regulation was solely to a state or crown prerogative? Part of the answer, of course, lies in the fact that in most ancient cultures, particularly those in the Middle East, the king was in fact also the chief or high priest, and the priesthood itself often fulfilled the function of the state bureaucracy. Nonetheless, the question remains, why associate money issuance with temples? And we're going to leave it at that there, guys. I want to keep these videos a little bit shorter, and I would love to keep going into length about this. I'm gonna absolutely get into more of the mystery of the temples and what Joseph Farrell's uncovered. I hope this has been a good detour into Bix Weir's work. I don't have a ton to offer on it. I have more to offer on my own thoughts that I'll be putting forth in the future. But this is just a good place to start and a good foundation for you to come to, and I really recommend it. And I will see you guys very soon with a new video. Thanks. Like, share, subscribe. Bye-bye.